next summer. We say, listen, this is what you missed, but this is what you could be doing. We're doing it again. We're doing it better. Please come. And it's a great way to make sure, as Skip was saying before, to make sure that we have our donors, to make sure that we can keep doing what we're doing, and we can keep providing this kind of community help and input. So if you want to participate in that, you want to give your story, you want to give some time to me, I would really appreciate it. So come find me. Thanks.
So we are on day 4, and I want to know, just by a show of hands, if you've been with us all week. Praise the Lord. It's been a long week, right? A fruitful week. And tonight is a special night, because tonight we're also going to hear and learn and engage, but understand what's happening in our society. Specifically, understand that there is a reality out there where our young people are in prison. Our young people, there's injustices happening throughout our nation. There are communities, the list goes on and on and on. So I want us to be ready tonight. And I want us to be open to the Spirit. As we understand that this is such a huge part of the work that we do. Even if you may not work specifically with certain communities that are being affected by this on a daily basis, it will also help to understand so that we know what to pray specifically for. So tonight, our theme is Youth on Lockdown, ministry to youth on the pipeline to prison. And again, we have with us Dr. Are you Reverend? Okay, that's right. Well, maybe Dr. Sarah Farmer. Amen? Amen. Help me in welcoming her.
I believe the children are our future. Teach them well and let them lead the way. Show them all the beauty they possess inside. Give them a sense of pride to make it easier. Let the children's laughter remind us how we used to be. Everybody searching for a hero. People need someone to look up to. Never found anyone who fulfilled my needs. A lonely place to be. That's why I learned to depend on me.
What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun? Or fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat? Or crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet? Maybe it just sags like a heavy load. Or does it explode? The poet Langston Hughes speaks of a reality where dreams are delayed, possibilities restricted, and asks us as readers, what happens to dreams deferred? Well, I propose to you that we don't have to go far to know the answer. That the imagery he invokes, dreams that have shriveled up against the heat of the sun, is a reality that lives in some of the communities we inhabit, or perhaps the youth we work with inhabit. It's interesting, people often wonder why a quiet, somewhat reserved young woman like me would take interest in topics like poverty, prison, and gang violence. And I'm the first to say that who I am has been very much shaped by where I've been. I grew up in a community where prison served more like a rite of passage than going to college. And it wasn't until my doctoral studies that I really had the language, both theoretical language, to articulate what I had witnessed growing up. This perspective is well illustrated in a story that I heard from an inner city teacher. She shared how she was talking to a second grader, and she asked the second grader, "Hey, what do you want to be when you grow up?" And the second grader kind of thought about it for a minute and then looked up at her and said, "I want to be a basketball player after I go to prison." And so she kind of looked puzzled and asked, "Why did you say after prison?" He responded, "Well, all my brothers and cousins went to prison." I thought that was what everyone did. To have prison as such a normal part of someone's future dreams that they cannot imagine life without it is a startling reality. For some, this reality is unimaginable, but for others, their futures really are short-circuited and colored by the possibility of prison. In this sense, to dream for another trajectory requires courage. And so I come to you today with this reality deep in my bones. And one of my vocational passions is understanding better how the pipeline works so that I and we, as people of faith, can find ways to counteract it. So our topic today, youth on lockdown, ministry to youth on the pipeline, our primary objectives is first to learn about and explore the pipeline to prison by talking briefly about some of the systemic ways that youth get stuck in the pipeline. And then second, we'll actually talk about crime and punishment and what the purpose of prison is, how we understand a biblical response to both incarcerated youth and youth who are susceptible to incarceration. And lastly, together, we will build a toolkit of direct approaches to address the pipeline for our context. So I want you to be prepared for a very interactive night, because it will be very interactive. Now, I'll be honest with you, I struggled with how to begin this, and it's because I understand that YMI has done a tremendous and applaudable job of attracting a cross-section of individuals from different cultures, socioeconomic backgrounds, communities, congregations, and political persuasions. In a society where we would rather play it safe, this is a courageous and communal space in here. Thus, this space is sacred, which means your participation in this communal and sacred space of diverse voices must be courageous. And so I want you to engage, but in order to do so, I created some ground rules, because we're going to be in intense dialogue and discussion. And the first rule is respect the mic. This is kind of spoken word and kind of rap lingo, but it basically means when someone else is talking, don't try to talk over them. Keep it short and simple. Tonight, we want to actually practice, not just talk about it, but practice respect and tolerance. These topics are relevant and can easily be politically charged. We know that this is a diverse group in many ways. Thus, instead of being offended by the difference you hear, be intrigued. Practice active listening. Allow our differences to open up a door to seek understanding, rather seek to be understood. Now, I know some of you may be coming from work and may have had to drive a long way, so I want you to choose to be present, because sometimes we can be in a space physically, but our emotions and our mentally be somewhere else. So I want you to choose to be present tonight and to participate, for your voice to be heard. I want you to acknowledge, so I'll acknowledge a lot about what's wrong, okay, in tonight, but for you, I want you to acknowledge what's wrong, but I want you to focus on what's possible, particularly when we start to get into our small groups. Really begin to focus on what's possible, because we can dream tonight. And lastly, I want you to, actually I think it's one more, learn from one another. And lastly, expect to be challenged, surprised, and inspired. Am I missing anything on this? Is that something that we all feel like we can agree to? Okay. So the very first thing I actually want us to do to get our discussion started around the pipeline to prison is I want you at your tables, and if you have a little bit of people, you may need to, like I'm looking at you, I know it's one person at your table, you may want to connect to another table. But the very first question I want you to respond to is, what is the purpose of punishment and what is the purpose of prison? And so just have that discussion at your table, and then I'll actually ask you to engage that question in more of a public way. So go ahead and discuss that for about 5 minutes. We'll take about 1 more minute. Okay, can I have your attention? Don't worry, you have an opportunity to discuss this more in what is called a fishbowl. And so I'm going to explain what a fishbowl is, and then I'm going to need 5 courageous souls to actually start it out. And this is something you can actually do in your youth group, a good way to kind of allow youth to be in conversation and also to practice active listening. So basically what I want people to do, I need 5 people to come up here and sit, and you will actually engage that question again, hopefully from different tables, the question, what is the purpose of punishment and what is the purpose of prisons? And you'll engage it in a conversation just with each other, and we out here will listen to them engage in conversation. Now, at any moment, someone in the audience that is sparked by the conversation or has something to contribute can stand up, tap a person on the shoulder. Hopefully that person would have at least spoken once. Tap that person on the shoulder and take their place, and then join the conversation, so that the people in the audience have agency to also participate in the conversation and dialogue that's going on. Is this clearly explained? Now, do I have 5 bold souls that will come? You could just come on up. Let's give our volunteers a hand. And so this is being recorded, so each time someone speaks, just pass around the mic. And I don't know who wants to start, but just the first question, you can ask each other questions. You can allow the conversation to evolve how it will, speak into the mic so that everyone can kind of hear you and be able to jump in. But we can start by asking the first question, what is the purpose of punishment?
Okay, when you talk about the purpose of punishment, if you're talking about the purpose of punishment in terms of the family, a child that runs into the street, a child that isn't doing his homework, that's one thing. But when you talk about the purpose of punishment as it pertains to the pipeline to prison, this is a different thing.
So you're talking to each other.
Yeah.
Well, I think punishment is a way of bringing about corrective behavior. So if you have someone that does something, or you have a child or even an adult, the purpose of punishment is hopefully that if you punish that child or punish that person, you're doing it with the intent that as a result of that, the behavior that you desire will somehow come into play.
True. But one of the things that's a little challenging with that is that we live with other people that are wounded and injured and might just punish to be mean or be unequal or just punish because they want to, and not necessarily with that that positive, corrective. You know, I think there's a difference between punishment and discipline.
I agree. I think that typically the purpose of punishment is to deter any individual from doing what they once did again. I think as it relates to the prison system, we live in a society where it says that if you do something wrong, you have to pay for that. And I believe that every action, as I'm sure everyone does, has a consequence. I believe solely that that is a purpose of the prison system. I think there's a nice tag on it that you go in, receive corrective behavior, then come back out, and hopefully you're reformed, you'll be a productive member of society. Unfortunately, that's not how it always works.
I think that punishment is kind of gives a person time to reflect on what they did. So it is a consequence to behavior, but it also gives you a period of time to look back and say, you know, how did I mess up? And I think that prison, you know, is very different. Again, like you said, you're talking about family and you're talking about other aspects of society where you're headed to prison, and that is removing a threat from society, again, to give that person time to change, well, not change, but improve behavior and reflect on behavior, I think.
But the thing is, before the punishment, have you evaluated? Have you looked at the child? Have you looked beyond what they are telling you? Look beyond what they've done. Have you stepped back, way back, and look at the reasoning? Do you know the reasoning this has happened? Because if you don't, you have a big problem.
I invite other people to come tap people on the shoulder from the audience. You can, at any moment, you can come and take someone's place if you have something to contribute.
Well, I know we're talking about the prison, the pipeline to the prison, or I may be saying it in reverse, but you started off talking about the family. So if we think about punishment, really when we think about it, it's more like in your family you work towards disciplining your child in the way that they should go. You think about Ephesians talking about, Father, provoke not your children. The Proverbs is filled with the way that a family should discipline or correct their child. And really, the discipline comes because something has gone wrong. There's been a breakdown in that child's behavior. And we say discipline, but we're giving them some form of punishment. And really, like you were saying, within the family, if the punishment or the discipline takes place properly, then some of what we're dealing with, I think, tonight in terms of the prison system, we wouldn't have. But because we don't have that, what has happened now is that our children are ending up in prison where there has to be some correction, there has to be some discipline, there has to be some punishment. But then, like you said, that the way the prison system is supposed to work, it doesn't, because you have people that are going into prison because they've committed some crime, and absolutely they have to be corrected for that crime, or they have to pay for that crime, but they come out and they go back into it and they do it again. So is there really the discipline or the correction of the punishment being done at that point? So I don't really know.
In talking about what punishment is, I would also raise the question, when is that punishment or when is that correction enough? Because we know that individuals do go into the prison system, then come out, they're not able to find jobs, they're not able to do all types of things. This is all after they've repaid their debt to society. They're still having issues. So then punishment maybe is okay, but when do we put a cap on that punishment? When is it enough? When does it stop? Because it seems that this individual is expected to come out and now contribute to society, but that mistake they made follows them for their whole life. When is that punishment enough?
But the other thing, too, with especially when you get to prison, is that it's very financially motivated, and it's also motivated because prisons are now privately owned, and they're money-making, and they're also tools of oppressing people. So the judgment to insert the punishment isn't fair. It's skewed. People are looking at it as a money-generating thing, number one, and number two, as a way to oppress people, a way to keep a certain group of people oppressed. The black person and the brown person. I mean, that's basically what it is. And I believe it's just a tool of oppression, and then you just can't have that fair judgment when you're dishing out the punishment. And society has this grab your pitchfork, eye for an eye mentality. Oh my God, you have a bag of marijuana, string them up, throw them in, throw them away for life, and ruin their lives forever. And it's just not fair.
I just, while everyone was speaking, I was considering, are correction and punishment, are they two synonymous terms? That's what we have to think about. Are they the same thing? And no, they're not. However, our society has called our prison institution correctional centers, right? So that means we have to think about the semantics or the meaning of the word correction in that purpose. And also, punishment, its general definition, could probably be a consequence of an offense. And we just have to remember punishment could cost someone their life. And the person who is being punished, so, like we want to say, it's a rehabilitative experience. It's time for you to meditate and to think on these concepts. But let's be realistic. The victim or the person who is going to jail or whoever he is, do they have an input in that process in our judicial system? And the answer is no. So the punishment is at someone's mercy. And we can't, I don't want to necessarily say it's a correctional identity.
I wanted to kind of go back to the difference between discipline and punishment, because I think there are two distinctive, different things. I think that discipline is more in the line of discipleship and teaching. So when we think about using that term and rearing our children, we put things in place that we teach them these things, and this is what's acceptable, this is what's not acceptable, this is how this works, this is how that works. And these are the choices that you get to make. And when you make these choices, these are the things that could possibly happen. There are good consequences and negative consequences. But in that process, we are then teaching our children. And I think when we teach, we are discipling our children, we are discipling people in our community, we are teaching people what the acceptable norm, quote unquote, is. And I think that they're two distinctively different things, and I just like to put out there that that's something that we need to consider, that punishment and discipline can be very different, because sometimes if we discipline our children, we don't need to punish them, because we have then now taught them.
Let's give our participants a hand clap. They did a great job, didn't they? And they actually really began to go into this next section that we'll talk about is what nature of justice is this? In Ethics of Punishment, Walter Moberly raises a question that I think we must ask and answer as people of faith. That question is, should a criminal be regarded by society chiefly as a nuisance to be abated, an enemy to be crushed, a debtor made to repay, a patient to be treated, or a refractory child to be disciplined? Or should he or she be regarded as none of these things, but simply as an example through which it can be demonstrated to other men and women that antisocial conduct does not pay? And some of what you were talking about, the two questions that you just finished discussing, what is the purpose of punishment and the purpose of prisons, is some of the questions that he is wrestling with. And I want to look at this, albeit brief. I'm not going to take a lot of time. You could do a whole class. I usually teach a whole class on this, but I do think it's important to look at some of the crime control theories, because the way you think about punishment actually does influence how you think it should be approached and how you should approach your youth. So the first one I want to make mention of is retributive. This one is very much rule-focused. If you break a law, someone talked about it here. If you break a law, you must pay. This type of crime control focuses on infliction of pain, and it rewards based on just deserts. And so this whole concept someone else talked about, eye for an eye or in a tooth for a tooth, it really wants you to pay in proportion to whatever crime you committed. It's very separate and different from mercy. Many people say this actually seeks to maintain the status quo. The central actors in this type of punishment is usually the state versus the individual. So the state, or sometimes God, actually becomes the victim when it operates like that. The goal is the offender paying the debt to society, and the victim is often ignored. Someone actually talked about this. I think when you were talking about a crime, we try to keep people from doing it. This theory is called deterrence, where it's a crime is focused on breaking the law, but is really focused on deterring crime. So this is a rewards-based thwarting crime, based on maintaining law and order, and it seeks to maintain the status quo. The central actors, which is different from retributive, the central actors is the state versus the perceived offenders. which is a little different from just the state versus whoever the individual is. So deterrence seeks to deter crime from the offender that already committed. They don't want the offender to commit more crimes, but also from anybody who might commit crimes, right? So they just want to avoid and deter having victims altogether. And so the goal ultimately is preventing crimes from taking place. Now, what's interesting about this policy or this kind of theory is this is actually the type of theory that gives rise to things like the death penalty and some of the harsh sentencing. Because whatever you need to do to deter crime, like incapacitation and things like that, or making people serve as an example to threaten others so that others won't do the crime, this is the type of theory that kind of undergirds that type of thinking. That may be a little hard to read, but this is rehabilitative, a very utilitarian approach. It sees punishment as a way to reform or rehabilitate the offender, a form of treatment to cure antisocial behaviors. And this is a really interesting, because when it was first practiced, and some of you may know the penitentiary, but when it was, which is the first kind of prison system, but when it was first practiced, really the mind and the soul rather than the body of the criminal was being targeted. So the programs was really instituted to help transition. It was really a Christian, in the beginning, it was really a Christian emphasis on repentance. And so some of the strengths of this approach is that it emphasizes virtues of care and compassion. The offender's interest is also part of the society's interest. Everyone wants the offender to change because this would benefit society. However, some of the dangers that's been articulated is that sometimes people conflate the crime with disease, and it takes the agency out of it in personal liability. And sometimes the criminal can be treated as an infant to be socialized or an animal to be trained rather than a rational thinker. And the approach that I'm more a proponent of, but all of us, at least most times, but is restorative justice, which is also a utilitarian approach, but it seeks to right wrongs. So it's focused on making right. It's a rewards based on need, based on mercy and love, and it seeks to transform the status quo, and the entire community is really taken into consideration. For instance, this perspective sees justice as being done only when the actual victim receives some form of restitution. Because in the criminal justice system, you can go through trial after trial, and the victim never actually is really considered, or they never receive restitution for what actually happens. But this is actually focused, it's very focused on the victim receiving restitution. But it's also not just focused on the victim and offender through restitution, but also the offender and the community. It's about restoring kind of relationship and kind of restoration in that sense. And so the offender being restored within oneself also by accepting responsibility. So that's just a little bit, we could talk a long time just about this, but we have limited time. But I wanted you to kind of just have this in your framing as we begin to continue our conversation. What do you think the United States fall? Where do you think the United States falls on? Yeah. We're the biggest jail in the world. More men in prison than in So it's the reason why we've been named Incarceration Nation. According to the Sentencing Project, the United States is the world's leader in incarceration, with 2.2 million people currently in prisons and jails, 500% increase over the last 40 years. And we're not even going to talk about why, but it is, and this question, now that we talked about kind of like the criminal justice system broadly and the purpose of crime and punishment broadly, the question that we really are talking about tonight is also, what is the purpose of a juvenile detention center? Is it the same? And I always think it's really interesting to look at the vision statement of the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention. This is what they say. It envisions a nation where our children are healthy, educated, and free from violence. if they come into contact with the juvenile justice system, the contact should be rare, fair, and beneficial to them. Now, I think that's a pretty good vision. I don't know what y'all think about it. It sounds really good, right? I don't know, you might think differently. It's something I found recently. But tonight, we also know that sometimes this type of vision is not always realized. Now, I will say, I've done a little research on Connecticut, just a little bit, and Connecticut seems to be kind of leading in some of the areas of reform within the juvenile justice system. Now, I don't know if that's the truth. That's what some of the things I read, but I was pleasantly surprised. But maybe if I kind of get into the system, I learn differently. But anyway, we want to talk about the pipeline to prison. So when I talk about the pipeline, what I'm talking about is the pathway by which youth are funneled from different entry points into the juvenile justice system. And this makes them more likely to end up in prison. And for me, when I talk about incarceration, I really talk about incarceration as a continuum. So some people talk about during incarceration, or some people talk about reintegration or reentry. Some people talk about just the pipeline of prison. I try to look at all of this as a continuum. And it's very important even for our efforts to look at this as a continuum, right? Because the more involved you are with somebody during incarceration, the easier it is for them to reintegrate into society. So it's just, or if you're involved with them before incarceration, maybe you can help deter incarceration. So I always look at it as a continuum as opposed to just separate entry points on it. So I really want to focus on three different things. I'm really going to spend most of my time talking about the school to prison pipeline, but it's really important to mention that poverty is a contributor to the pipeline. Marian Wright Edelman actually calls this the cradle to prison pipeline because she says it starts in the womb. If you're born into poverty, it's actually a driving force of incarceration. It's a driving force into the pipeline. And statistics show, which is kind of startling, nationally, 1 in 3 black boys, 1 in 6 Latino boys, and 1 in 17 white boys born in 2001 are at risk of imprisonment during their lifetime. Further, a black girl born in 2001 has a 1 in 17 chance of being incarcerated, while a Latino girl has a 1 in 45 chance, and a white girl a 1 in 111 chance of being incarcerated. And once again, poverty is what the Children's Defense Fund says. Poverty is one of the most pervasive driving forces of incarceration. And so as we move forward, I think it's important to look at what Marian Wright Edelman says. And she says the pipeline is not an act of God or inevitable, but it's a series of human choices at each stage of our children's development. And it's interesting because when we think about some of the key national indicators of health, some of the very things such as inadequate health care, things like that, these are the same indicators of poverty. When people can't get access to health care or mental health, it may be a contributor to the pipeline. For instance, research indicates that a child is abused every 35 seconds. So environments that are fundamentally unsafe may cause someone to run away, and then that they get picked up for running away, which may be a contributor to the pipeline. So some of these things, all of these things are indicators. My PowerPoint's a little off. So family and social environment. So these are the key national indicators of children's well-being. Family and social environment, economic circumstances, health care, physical environment and safety, behavior and education. Once again, these type of things when poverty is poverty is a factor, sometimes these are some of the very things that are also threatened. So another contributor to the pipeline is the school-to-prison pipeline. And the definition of the school-to-prison pipeline, it refers to policies and practices that push our nation's school children, especially our most at-risk children, out of classrooms and into the juvenile and criminal justice system. And this is mostly probably a factor in public schools. And why is this a problematic situation? Well, Angela Davis, highlights that prison sometimes serves as, I quote, an abstract site into which undesirables are deposited, relieving us of the responsibility to think about the real issues afflicting those communities which prisoners are drawn in such disproportionate numbers. And so this is a quick, we'll talk a little bit more about each of these, but this is a quick kind of illustration of some of the very things that actually contribute to the pipeline. And so I want to show you a quick video that illustrates the school-to-prison pipeline.
When a kid gets in trouble at school, we used to send them to the principal's office. Now we're suspending, expelling, or even arresting kids for the smallest misbehaviors. This trend is called the school-to-prison pipeline. There are pipelines all across the country. Nationwide, as many as 95% of out-of-school suspensions are for nonviolent misbehaviors like these. In one town, the cops were called to break up a fight, a water balloon fight. When you crack down harshly on kids for minor infractions, you're telling them one thing: you are a problem. Suspending or expelling a kid increases his or her chance to drop out of high school. And we know high school dropouts are 3.5 times more likely than high school graduates to be arrested in their lifetime. Sending a kid to juvenile detention center also makes crime more likely in their future. Kids who are incarcerated are 67% more likely to be back in jail by the age of 25 than similar kids who didn't go to prison. And this zero tolerance policy doesn't apply to everyone equally. In Wake County, North Carolina, which has one of the largest school-to-prison pipelines, 40% of black kids caught with cell phones were suspended, while only 17% of white kids were suspended for the same thing. Though blacks and Latinos make up only 29% of public school students, they make up 70% of students involved in in-school arrests or who are referred to law enforcement. Schools even crack down on special needs students, arresting them for the very behaviors that stem from their special needs. 32% of youth in juvenile detention are special needs students. That's the school-to-prison pipeline, another way that the United States incarcerates more people than any other country on earth.
And so I just wanted, so first of all, it's important to recognize when people talk about the pipeline, the reason why it's looked at systemically is because it's not really one particular thing that causes the pipeline, but it's actually a combination of different things that happen sometimes systemically that actually contributes to the pipeline. So that's, when we talk about pipeline, we're talking about several factors kind of moving into this direction that's causing youth to kind of move in that way. And so I want to talk about some contributors, and I want to start actually by talking about inadequate resources, because overcrowded classrooms, a lack of qualified teachers, and insufficient fundings for extras such as counselors, special education services, and even textbooks lock students into second-rate educational environments. And unfortunately, this failure to meet educational needs increases disengagement and dropouts. And we know that dropouts actually increase the risk of later court involvement. And so while inner city schools, this is what the American Civil Liberties Union thinks, they feel like while inner city schools experience inadequate funding, that so much of the funding is actually used for security and kind of disciplinary purposes as opposed to on the resources needed to provide youth with adequate education. But the other thing that the video alluded to is these disciplinary codes that have become known as zero tolerance policies. We could think about that in the larger criminal justice system as well. But the thing about it with the school to prison pipeline is that misbehavior that is usually nonviolent actually becomes criminalized. So a study by the National Education Policy Center found that zero tolerance policies across the nation were increasing suspension rates, particularly for Black and Latino students accused of nonviolent offenses such as dress code violations, cell phone use, attendance or truancy issues, and insubordination. They found that zero tolerance policies put children on a path of truancy and then likely incarceration. And so what happens, as the video also alluded to, is that minor disciplinary problems no longer are resolved through parents or teachers or school administrators, but addressed through things such as suspensions and expulsions and arrests. And then sometimes when you get a certain amount of those, then children then get funneled into an alternative school system. And we know that the alternative school system doesn't always have the highest kind of educational standards, which may lead to dropout. And so all of this becomes part of what the pipeline is. And Michelle Alexander, when she talks about the mass incarceration and this crisis, she calls it does anybody know? The new Jim Crow. She calls it the new Jim Crow because race is also very much a part of this system. Minority students enter the pipeline at a higher rate than white students. The U.S. Department of Education's office, for instance, saw that over 70% of students involved in school-related arrests or referred to law enforcement are Hispanic or African American. What is interesting about it is no studies show that an increase in out-of-school suspension and expulsion reduces disruption in the classroom, and some evidence suggests actually the opposite. And so in general, rates of suspension and expulsion appear unrelated to overall school success when you're looking at schools with similar characteristics and levels of funding and student populations. And so the purpose of exclusion really is to deter, and we talked about deterrence, to deter student behavior and to make it a more teachable environment for those who actually want to learn, which is good. But scholarly research shows that students who are suspended or expelled are far more likely than other students to drop out of school, which is where the kind of bad thing is. So moreover, minority children are retained, suspended, and expelled at a higher rate than white students. Students that have dropped out of high school are 3 times more likely to be incarcerated than their in-school peers. And I know some of you may already know that by the 2nd or 3rd grade, some of the tests, the reading tests and some of the tests, they use that to determine how they're going to build out their prisons. And so even that is an indication of how society thinks about the future of our children, that students who perform lower are kind of short-circuited from certain possibilities.
You mentioned the unevenness. One of the problems that exists is that the police is called for kids in the inner cities when there is a problem. But in the suburban schools, the parents and the administrators deal with it. So in the inner cities, you get a record at a very early age, which means later on you can't even get a job because you have a record. So the way that there is such an unevenness in the criminal justice system is because our kids are in the schools being arrested by a policeman, but those problems are dealt with very differently in the suburban schools. So that's part of the system.
And the over-policing of inner schools, which is the very next point that you just made, which is great. But many under-resourced schools become pipeline gateways by placing an increased reliance on police rather than teachers, just like you said, and administrators to maintain discipline. And sometimes when the school resource officers are in the school, they're not necessarily trained on how to engage the students, which also makes students far more likely to be subject to school-based arrest, which once again funnels, goes into the alternative school where they become more likely to get involved in the criminal justice system. And so what's difficult is even when there are attempts to deroute youth who have been caught in the juvenile detention center and traditional schooling, they face so many barriers. And so that's part of the issue. And then I want to talk about two more things with this, the No Child Left Behind. So everyone is familiar with No Child Left Behind. This emphasis on excessive high-stakes testing that leads to transferring out low-performing students in order to increase a school's overall test scores. There's no incentive to keep low-performing students and actually work with them. And so sometimes schools actually maintain funding or get financial incentives for better test scores. And these issues are really complex, right? So I'm saying one thing, but it's a lot of things that go into this. Once again, as statistics show, many minority children are undereducated and pushed out of public schools. And then the thing that, for me, that I actually experienced a lot, when I was in public school, is this academic tracking. According to the Applied Research Center, tracking is the practice of placing students in different classes based on perceived differences in their ability. So the placement of students into courses based on their performance and or standardized achievement tests or IQ tests, and in previous courses in the same discipline. And so it takes a couple different forms. It takes remedial education or special education, also for gifted and talented students as well. Now, at the high school level, I don't know if you've heard, I don't know if they still call it this in the high school, but it was tech prep in college preparatory classes when I was going through. And the thing is, once you get on a kind of TP, tech prep track, by the time you get to the end, and if your parents really haven't been on it or don't have access to the knowledge, by the time you get to the end of that tech prep, you really haven't received what you need in order to go into college. So only those people who have the CP classes actually can go into college. And so once again, sometimes, this academic tracking system can be driven by pessimistic attitudes about students' achievement. For instance, if my attitude is students can't make it, how do you think my behavior as a teacher is going to be? Maybe don't try, right? Or if my attitude is only certain students can make it, my behavior may actually result in a dual tracking system. And an article in the New York Times a few Augusts back talked about a senator in New Orleans who thought he had to actually create a dual system, a dual tracking system, a tracking system for students who won't make it and one for students who will make it. And so the question becomes, is your child headed in the right direction? Who chose their direction? And what's difficult is that, I haven't even, this is a whole nother conversation about special education. And why are there so many minority students in special education? Harry Kilgner actually documents the overrepresentation of minority students in special education. But it kind of functions in this kind of way when you're in special education. There's a stigma attached to you. And then special education students are then segregated and then silenced and then sometimes suppressed. In the news, there's been some accounts where you see teachers actually literally kind of, disciplining students in a very an inhumane way, and then sentenced. And so that's kind of for special education students or students who've been placed into special education, this is kind of like the trajectory sometimes it works for them, that they're stigmatized, segregated, silenced, suppressed, and then sentenced. And so once again, I've talked a lot, but I want you to hear from some students who actually talk about their experience.
The school-to-prison pipeline, the government spends more money on prisons than they do in schools, and how the schools lack resources, and how they're in a criminal environment, and therefore they end up in prison. We've been to schools that treat us like we're animals. We've been to schools that don't trust us. We've been to schools that don't have no expectations of us at all.
If they expected us to graduate, they'll like help us more and have like more programs.
We don't have enough textbooks. We don't have enough qualified teachers in their subjects, but we have prisons that have everything ready for an inmate. I feel like it degrades. It's really frustrating.
The school I go to, we have a precinct, like on the first floor. Precinct right there on the first floor, and like that makes me feel like more of a criminal than a student. I don't feel like they trust us too much, because if you do trust people that's trying to get an education, you would have metal detectors in the school, period.
A criminalized environment to me in school deals with the school safety agents.
If they're there to keep us safe, why do they treat us like we're in jail? I wish that they would focus more on the education than suspending us. I was going to school. I went through the metal detector, they found the cell phone inside my bag, and they asked me to remove the cell phone out my bag, to go inside my bag and all that. If they would have talked to me like I was an animal, I would have cooperated like just fine, but the school safety agent spoke to me like I was a dog. It was just like, open up your bag, what's inside your bag? Since I wouldn't let them search my bag, they decided to call the cops so they could search the bag. They called the cops, they sat me down, waited like for 2 hours just for the cops to get there. I was missing class, I basically missed the test. It's just a cell phone, it's not like I had a knife on me. When the cops came, they took it out my bag, and then I was sent home, suspended for a day. They just put me outside. Like, I really have nothing to do except just be in the street where a cop could just stop me because I'm supposed to be in school at those hours and take me to jail because of that. If you suspend us, you're putting us in the street. You're putting us in a place where we can actually do more damage to ourselves than we can do in school.
A lot of friends of mine just don't come to school.
When you get suspended, you do your time into a suspension site school. You do work, but you do lower work, like second grade work, kindergarten work. And like when you go back to your regular school, you're like, dang, I'm not really up to this level yet. The teachers are giving me so much homework now, I don't even know what to do with it. I'm not gonna do the homework, so you end up getting failing grades. And after the failing grades, it comes to like, you know, you dropping out of high school. When you drop out of high school, you end up selling drugs, whatever you do to survive. And then that's when you end up in the system.
How are we expected to learn and prosper in an environment that I feel just penalizes us?
They're robbing us of our education and our creativity.
It really makes us feel like the government is just setting us up not for nothing good. It's like they're trying to erase us from where we at.
It makes me feel like, really, I have no purpose. It's like, my only purpose is to go to jail. But the way I'm dealing with that is basically, I'm trying to prove everybody wrong by graduating, passing, you know, doing what I gotta do.
We're not criminals, we're students.
Sorry, guys.
Fear. So a lot of times, some of the school to prison pipeline is actually motivated by fear. And what's ironic is that sometimes the toughest policies are being put in place when actually statistics are showing that crime and that the crime or youth offending is actually decreasing. But these kind of get tough on crime policies are still being put in place. And I just want to talk really, really briefly about the pipeline for girls, because it operates a little differently. And for girls, sometimes it's more or less abuse takes place. And in order to kind of cope with abuse, so statistics show, and this is for really women and girls, that maybe about 70% or more have reported some form of abuse. And so a lot of times in the women's criminal justice system, women are in there for nonviolent offenses. The same thing with girls. It mirrors the women criminal justice system. So a lot of times, Beth Ritchie has called this like a gendered pathway, but abuse may lead women or girls to run away or to kind of cope through like addiction, or they may also be in prison for truancy offenses. And some scholars say that we criminalize the survival strategies and coping mechanisms of young girls when they've been abused. But overall, regardless of the picture I've showed you, I hope that this illustrates at least the ways that children can easily enter the pipeline that leads to prison and subsequently steals their dreams, kills their vision, and destroy any sense of joy. So I know you're probably wondering, what's joy got to do with it? And so I want to talk briefly about where youth ministry intersects with the pipeline and the possibilities of producing joy rather than inhibiting it. And a lot of my comments will be coming from this book, so buy it if you don't already have it, Joy in Human Flourishing. And I really want to draw on a couple authors that talk, but one is Miroslav Volf. Angela mentioned this earlier, this tripartite kind of hypothesis that joy is about a gentle, circumstantial, and effective, about a life that represents a life going well. So that is a life that has subjective and or objective sense of well-being, which is the circumstantial. And then a life led well, that a life that follows in accordance with our nature or perhaps God, which is a gentle dimension. And then also a life that feels well, which is the affective dimension. And the pipeline, unfortunately, disrupts the circumstantial kind of dimension, particularly when people are left in what Marian Wright Edelman identifies as a purgatory of hopelessness and uncertainty. So in other words, the pipeline hijacks the future of our youth by deferring their hopes and dreams. I propose that youth ministry is in a unique position to help youth discover and fulfill these longings. And I'm really moved by what Mary Clark Michelle has to say about joy. In this text, she writes about joy. She's really talking about the joy of those who cares for others. But she writes, I've studied, joy comes down to this, to being awake and deeply alive, aware of the love and goodness of God, and mindful of the wondrous gift of life. Joy emanates from the love of neighbor and a sense of calling to stand with the least of these, those who are socially, economically, or politically marginalized. This joy is not naive, but committed to caring. Joy in pastoral ministries, and I will also propose youth ministries, is magnified by the blessing of a sense of vocation that challenges one to step outside of oneself into relationships of care and communion. What Michelle realizes from her observations of caregivers is that people who fulfill their vocation, a vocation that has been assigned to all Christians, experience intense joy. And let's talk about what this Christian vocation is. In Micah 6:8, it reads, "He has shown you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? To act justly and to love mercy and to walk humbly with your God." We also hear of the vocation of Christian ministry in Matthew 25, where God will invite those who have fed the hungry, given drink to the thirsty, clothed the naked, show hospitality to strangers, visit the poor, and those in prison to inherit the kingdom of God. And so as we participate in these type of acts within our youth ministry, not only do we experience joy, but we invite God's kingdom to come on earth as it is in heaven. And so as we move into thinking more explicitly about the ways that youth ministry can help counteract the pipeline, it's important for us to ask two critical questions that we will engage in further depth during some of your small group time a little later. But these two questions is, the first one, can the pipeline to prison be redeemed? And I think even more critical question is, what is the role of youth ministry in redeeming the pipeline? And I guess my response to that question is, let the redeemed of the Lord say so. To be clear, we as youth ministers stand in a unique position to respond to some of these challenges. And I never want to minimize the fact that some youth just make bad decisions. But I also want to make sure we understand that during the youth and young adult years, it really is a time for them to explore, discover, experiment, and make mistakes, which is not uncommon. And it's really important for youth ministries to be able to kind of be in the gap as youth kind of do some of that exploration. It's interesting in the same book that I was talking about, that Justin Crisp points out something that I really think is important for youth ministry to keep in mind. He points out that the three parables in Luke 15, those parables is the lost sheep, the lost coin, and the prodigal son, all describe God's reaction to repentance in terms of joy and second chances. So the biblical testimony of joy then is one of new life, redemption, and second chances. And it's unfortunate that some of our churches really don't have a robust theology of grace, mercy, and forgiveness that actually integrates understandings of discipline as a form of love. Instead, we have often ascribed to an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth theology that would rather seek retributive justice. And so one of the conversations earlier that I appreciated, and one of the things that you had already begun to wrestle with, and you're about to break into small groups, so you'll wrestle with this a little bit more, but someone was asking about what's the difference between discipline and punishment. And in Reclaiming Our Prodigal Sons and Daughters, the authors Scott Larson and Larry Barrento describe what they see as the major differences between discipline and punishment. For them, they see discipline as having a climate of mutual respect, whereas punishment respects those in power. They see discipline as problems are opportunities rather than problems require punishment. So they see discipline as preventative rather than reactive. Discipline as having natural consequences as opposed to arbitrary. Discipline as actually an articulated reason for the standards rather than do it because I said so. That discipline demands responsibility, which is a little different than simply demanding obedience. That discipline teaches caring values rather than just rule compliance. That discipline sees adults as coaches and adults as rulers. And so as we move into thinking more explicitly about what our youth ministries can do, I wanted to call on the quote of Martin Luther King Jr., who says, "God has two outstretched arms. One is strong enough to surround us with justice, and one gentle enough to embrace us with grace." And sometimes we have an either-or mentality, but what does it mean for our ministries and our theologies to really have a robust kind of understanding of what justice is and an understanding of grace? Is one more thing I want to talk about, and someone alluded to this also earlier in the conversation. What happens is oftentimes when the justice system, with the justice system often tries to kind of get at the top layer, right? They want behavior. And, B.F. Skinner, behavioral psychologist B.F. Skinner kind of teaches, and they kind of operate on this system that if they do good, we'll reward them. If they do bad, we're going to punish them. We'll do something to punish them. And sometimes you see that youth will actually, if they're in some type of facility, they'll actually do well. But soon as they get out the facility, as somebody alluded, maybe because they're put back into their same environment, or maybe because it wasn't a real heart change, what happens is they still go back to the same kind of behaviors. But what is really unique in what youth ministry is uniquely positioned to do is to really get at the root of faith, to get at the root of values, and to get at the root of the attitude. And what these authors argue is that oftentimes, sometimes you have things that deal with the attitude, very kind of cognitive, thinking, or sometimes you have programs that deal with the values. But it's really a gap in the programs that deal with faith and really getting people to think about their view of God and how that view of God is actually, it really does shape a person's identity and their existence. And so one of the things I propose tonight is that what we have a unique opportunity to do as youth ministers is actually get at the root of it and begin to talk about youth and teach youth about their faith, the very foundation that all of these other things are built on. We've used these scriptures before about not being conformed to the world and about keeping your heart with all diligence, for from it flows the springs of life. So these, again, are the things that the church is really valued and can really make a difference in. And I think it's really important. In Georgia, they have actually adopted something called the Healing Communities model, which is a faith-based model of reentry, because even the government sees that it's some issues that the criminal justice system can't address that churches and congregations can. And so now we have some small group work. What I want you to do in your groups and at your table is, what are some key features of your theology of ministry to youth and children? Write down some of your, what kind of theology of ministry to youth would you articulate? And so just write down 5 statements that kind of capture this theology of ministry. So you can talk with the people at your table. So I just want to, just in case you don't, just in case to kind of further explain what a theology of youth ministry is, just how do you view youth? What type of theological kind of resources do you use to kind of view youth, and what type of perspective, biblical perspective, do you use in order to view youth? And so that's what we're asking.
Would I be distracting you? I wrote down the rationales for incarceration
He said the way is. Yeah.
And in Sweden, where they spend 4 times as much money, their recidivism rate is 72%. So it's a lovely concept. We should do it. But the notion that we're going to change recidivism meaningfully is this is where the cynicism is. And this is where mass incarceration is. Any of those things. The only thing we know that works.
Sorry to interrupt you. I've had some requests for books and authors that you're mentioning because they're going quite quickly and people are wanting to write them down.
Okay.
Are they
They're in the resources, yeah.
Okay, so if you could just say
I
that
will.
to them, at least at the end or something, so
Okay.
they know. Something like, I know I went through these authors really fast. but
Oh,
there's
I
a
did
list of-
do a lot. I did actually, okay. It's some I did, like reclaiming our prodigal sons and daughters. I didn't.
Yeah. They were just like, like the option, and it all sounded like so
Okay.
either do a quick read at the end, or just be like, I know I went through these really quick, but they're all on your resources and your flash drive. So
I have to go back. Okay.
I'm happy to.
Are there's? Okay.
Okay, thank you.
New York.
Too expensive.
Let's lock every person who is at risk. That wasn't justice for what they did. It wasn't deterrence. It was weighty. And it wasn't as easy as they did.
Yeah.
It was just let them age out of the energy. And that was awfully simple. But I think if you don't own how we got there, they would have quitted on those things. They might have said they were.
That's interesting.
Rhetoric might have been, but that's what they did. I was there. I mean, I was 24 years old, Boston District, when the head of the Retributive
That's interesting. Wow. Right. That's interesting. Yeah, it is. I want to call you back really quickly. You will have another chance to be in your small groups. Can I get your attention? So you will have a chance to get back into your groups. This is the easy part. You're about to get your hands a little more dirty with the next step of this activity, but I wanted to go through quickly. A lot of people, when they're thinking about kind of building their toolkit, the question is, where do we start? And so these are some of the approaches you might think about taking or you might want to take. And this can take place with a church who is kind of ingrained in this type of school to prison pipeline work or the pipeline of prison, or a church who may not really think is as relevant for their youth. You can still find an approach here that allows you to kind of exercise a sense of justice and care for issues related to the pipeline. And the first one is just an educational approach, and that is really raising your awareness about issues in your church. The thing is, some people genuinely don't know, and if they knew, they would actually care. But this isn't always talked about. It's being talked about a lot more now, but it's not always talked about. So just an educational approach where you kind of can raise awareness. The other thing I would say is taking a relational approach where you're building relationships with people who are actually incarcerated or people who have been incarcerated. And also the other thing is to recognize that there is a stigma around incarceration, and that is actually people, there may be people in your church that said their child was shipped to the South on vacation or to go to school and they're actually locked up. It was a very common thing that you would say that because you didn't want the stigma associated with a child or relative being locked up. So it actually may be people in your congregations who are impacted by incarceration very severely, and you can build relationships with them. The next thing is a programmatic approach. There are some programs that you could develop in your church to kind of get started. And then lastly, an advocacy approach. Things that your youth ministry can begin to advocate for, such as equitable education or ban the box. And once again, I just want to mention the incarceration continuum again, that as we move into this next activity, which is really going to be translating your theology into praxis through looking at a case study of a youth that may be in your youth group, I want to talk about some real more practical things in thinking about this. So a lot of times when we think about the pipeline, we're thinking about prevention. And some of the ways that I've seen churches actually do this is they may adopt a school in their community, and particularly maybe a struggling school. And in this effort, anytime they need kind of resources, they may provide financial resources, or if they need volunteers to work the lunch, they would get people from their church to actually go volunteer. And then what ended up happening, and I'm thinking about Impact Church in Atlanta, Georgia, that kind of does this model of adopt a school, and other churches around the U.S. is also doing this model. But when things happen in the school system, the first people they call are the volunteers, the people that have been coming consistently and diligently. So that's a direct kind of way to kind of get into the school system and to work with youth. Also, mentoring programs, an after-school mentoring program or tutoring program. Another really important way that churches have begun to kind of deal with the pipeline is transportation program for children who have incarcerated parents, who have incarcerated parents, because they understand that children who have incarcerated parents are, I think, 3 times more likely to be incarcerated, maybe 5 times more likely. I don't have the statistic in front of me, but more likely to be incarcerated. So to be able to kind of keep that relationship. And then in a curriculum that also can be done in youth ministry is activities similar to kind of what we did tonight, like the Fish Bowl, where you can actually just start talking about these issues with your youth. Some of the things that if you might want to do if youth are incarcerated is intervention. So a Bible study, quite frankly, sometimes the Bible studies can be a little dry that churches go into prisons to do. So I've taught in a prison, and I've helped direct a Theological Studies Program in the prison, and the way that some of the women talked about the Bible Studies Program is that it wasn't always the most beneficial, although they appreciated people coming in, but that sometimes the Bible studies was more shame-filled than liberating. But you can also find inroads in a prison to help conduct activities where youth might enjoy, getting youth to talk. Art is a really huge activity, conflict resolution training, those type of things. And also just toiletries. Sometimes youth need toiletries in the detention center. That's really big, or even like a pen pal program that would be heavily supervised can also be inspiring. And then lastly, advocacy or just integration, period, as people reintegrate. And The thing I want to talk about, so many times, Shad Maruna writes about this in an article called Rituals of Reintegration, but he's basically, a lot of times, incarceration itself is a rites of passage. And oftentimes when you think about incarceration, you think about the courtroom scene where there's a judge and you're actually taken and then you're unclothed and sometimes your head is shaved and you're given a number. It's a very ritualistic process. And Maruna argues that there's so much of a rites of passage, right? Another author, Brainwhite, calls it rituals of degradation. But there's so much of a rites of passage where youth or people who are incarcerated are kind of losing their identity. But we don't always have a ritual of reintegration, right? Where they're being reintegrated back into the community, where perhaps family, congregation members, law enforcement officers, judges are actually taking part in this process of saying, you belong to this community. That's been a common theme throughout our nights. But this is also something that churches can really participate is in creating rituals of reintegration. So I just wanted, before I ask you to do the next activity, I wanted to give you a few ideas. But you have the ideals at your table, and you have a case study at your table. Some of you have a case study of a boy named Thomas, and some of you have a case study of a girl named Jewel. These are taken from the Children's Defense Fund, the Cradle to Prison Pipeline, which is an over 200-page document that is on your flash drive. A lot of statistics that I talked about today came from that, but you do have that. And I just want you to talk about briefly in your groups, imagine that the person that you're reading about is in your church. Which approach are you going to use to address this person? Are you preventing, advocating, intervening, or doing a little of everything? And what I'm really interested in is you just wrote down statements, right, about your theology of youth ministry. We don't just want that to be an official kind of explicit theology, but we want it to be operative. So how are you going to translate that into your approach, into what you do with and for youth? And then also, we know that there's challenges. So what challenges do you foresee? How will you navigate these challenges? And if we have time when we come back, we'll do another fishbowl to kind of get some of these out. If we have time, we'll see. So take about 5 minutes to do that. Okay, 10 minutes. 10 minutes. Take about 10 minutes. Sorry.
But you see my point. The beauty of having such a diverse representation here is they all represent churches.
Yeah.
So their takeaways.
I do want to think about rituals of reintegration. I think, like, make a curriculum that focuses on, like, what type of things can you do when someone has been released? What type of rituals can you do?
That's my family. Who the hell are you? You're reintegration. The matriarch of the family. My cousin, Irene. Jimmy, is that you, Jimmy? Come here, Jimmy. Oh, there you go. We're so proud of you. You're out. You're doing great. Love it. Well, now there's so many folks.
Yeah.
That's reintegration.
Yeah, it is.
And a year later, one of my friends died. They bought him a suit so he could walk. That's reintegration.
Yeah.
But that makes all the difference in the world.
All the difference, yeah. Yep. Well, let's see.
Isn't theology beside worship?
Well, that is what ends up happening. I'm gonna let them do the fishbowl again and talk about these. They did really good with the fishbowl, didn't they?
Say what?
They did really good with the fishbowl.
Yeah, but you know what I see? It's a lawyer
Yeah, yeah. But that's how dialogue happens. That's how.
That's not that, but
Yeah. Yeah.
their heart starts to warm towards wanting to say a pathetic word. You know who does the very worst job?
Well, maybe I'll just go around instead of doing the fishbowl. That's not what we talked about.
And the next person doesn't even respond to the or the Bible says, so what's really
Yeah. How are you doing? If I give y'all 2 more minutes, is that too short? 2 more minutes? Okay, so y'all. Oh, you talk about the person. If I give y'all about 2 more minutes, is that going to be enough time? Okay. Let's take about 2 more minutes. Go ahead and finish up. Yeah, just one more. Okay, I want to gather you back. Can I get your attention? I want to gather you back, and I want to ask people who had the case study of Thomas. Oh, so can I get 5 volunteers who would be willing to discuss in a group what kind of approach or thinking how are you going to intervene or help Thomas if he came into your youth group? So just 5 volunteers who would be willing to talk together about what you would do with Thomas. Any volunteers? She can't talk to herself. Anybody else? Okay, I guess we'll get started with 4 people. If someone wants to, 4 people. If someone wants to, thank you. Here comes our 5th person. So if you could start just by talking a little bit about who Thomas is and what his situation is, and then talk as if you're a planning committee or, a group of youth ministers. Okay. And this boy has walked into your youth group and you're trying to figure out what are you going to do.
Do you want to give the background on him and then we can... Okay. Okay, so Thomas is a boy from Mississippi who he was abandoned as a child and is considered a troublemaker. So he was sent to Columbus Training School for 2 months and 2 days, first for attempting to put another student in bodily harm, and then he was brought to youth court for truancy, basically for being suspended all the time. He has an IEP. He was charged with stealing a cell phone because other kids said that they saw him do it. And his brother was charged with possessing the cell phone after it was stolen. Let's see. And then both of the boys were sent to the correction system. That's what I'm guessing it is. And basically, so Thomas also, he got into a fight with some of the security guards because, they were pushing him and kind of not really listening to him. So he kind of got mad and started to react to that. So basically, Thomas is a kid who has been continuously put into the system and not really listened to. So with our group, I was thinking that maybe we would start with the relational form of ministry, because considering that Thomas is a kid who hasn't really had many people to trust, that people in authority have put him down and have put him in his place, I'm not thinking that the first step of advocacy would be the right route to go, because Thomas might not be able to trust that. He might not be able to trust you or the community as a person. So we want to consider him a member of the community first rather than a project, and then work on the advocacy later on from there. But you need to build the relationship first.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I guess our point was a little bit intermingled with what you just said. I guess our point was a little bit intermingled with what you just said as far as advocacy and relational. It was obvious, at least from what was reported here, by what Thomas had to say, and then ultimately by the action of the courts, that something was wrong. So I felt we were really more talking about help him to, and his parents, to learn to empower himself and to be able to advocate for himself, to write a letter to the court system to get those things removed from his record, and not just think of it in the situation where it's just Thomas, because depending on what area he's in, it could be more than one. So building the faith-based support group for them as well to actually have a voice.
I echo both of you, what you just said, that it is definitely relational. And I think our group understood that the relationship he needs to be restored, redemption needs to occur with him. And I think not only pastoring him and his family because it seems that he needs counseling because of this experience, but having the support of the youth behind him. So when he does go back to school, or just knowing that he's in a safe community in which his friends and people his own age can support him, was important before advocacy work.
I think we were at the next step where we talked about advocacy, perhaps the pastor, the youth minister, going to anything he had to go to in terms of court and that. Mm-hmm. But we talked a lot about the first sentence. The first sentence being that the child had been beaten and abandoned. And right there, that was the cause of it. These things happened. He was sent to a training school, away from his parents, and away from his mother, away from his friends. It should have been done in community, in the church, with the help that he needed, not abandoned.
So what I would do is I will get the church ready first and make sure they understand what kind of youth we're going to be bringing to the church. Because from my experience, I will bring 14-year-old Walter to my youth ministry, and they're going to look at him and be like, this is a troubled teen. And I don't want this troubled teen around my kids. So before I would even bring them, I will actually prep the church for who I'm bringing. The next thing I would do is I will not have anyone introduce me to Walter. I will find a way for me to meet Walter one-on-one, so Walter doesn't see me as he has another person who's coming to help him. Because at 14, he met a lot of people who said they're going to help, and they never help. So I will find a way to meet him without no one introducing me. After that, I will build a relationship with Walter or Thomas, because they're both there. They're both brothers. Usually, I try to get all the friends together, so that would have worked. But Thomas, then, after I meet Thomas and Thomas tells me his story and tells me what he went through, and then I will become an advocate for Thomas. But I will wait for Thomas first to give me his story and tell me, hey, I got beat up, I went to this juvenile center, this is what happened, and give me his story, and then I will start to advocate for him. You know, the truth of the matter is, it's going to take time, you know, and he's going to be mad, and it's just going back and forth for a very long time. But the truth of the matter is, the church part, that'll be like the last thing.
Let's give our volunteers a hand. So I don't want us to leave thinking that ministry to youth on the pipeline is easy. And that's why I gave you these case studies, because you can see that these issues are multi-layered, they're complex, and it really does take a village. And so when we think about how do we build our toolkit, one of the things is, you know, how you approach this is going to be contextual. You know, it's going to be based on your church or your youth ministry and the issues that's happening around you. And so you may even want to begin with a contextual analysis of some of the issues that's taking place in your community. The other thing to build your toolkit is a referral process. We know that all of us may not be trained to give mental health counseling or to do social work or to do some of the things that are needed to kind of intervene. And so being able to have a quick referral process to know who they can go to and who to call when you need to call is very important in building your toolkit. It can even function as a list of numbers. When this happens, call this person. When this happens, call this person. So that you have it on hand and it's quick. The next thing I would say is a multidisciplinary, committed, and compassionate team, where on your team of people, you're thinking about people who have multiple kind of skills and kind of backgrounds, right? So you may have someone who is gifted in pastoral ministry and could serve as a pastoral care person, or someone who could serve as a mentor, or someone who has done social work who can bring that background to the youth ministry. So just a multidisciplinary, or once again, knowing who you can refer to get help. The other thing is, we talked about this, about the boredom that youth experience. To have a gathering space or a safe space that your church offers to youth who may be on the pipeline to the prison, an alternative space so that they don't go to the streets to kind of where they might get caught up in something because they were in the wrong place at the wrong time or because they were bored. Also, just relevant and informed programming. And one of the ways to have relevant and informed programming is listen to the voice of youth. Talk to your youth to understand what type of programming would be useful and helpful. Involve youth in a process of deciding how your youth ministry can actually take an eye or really take advantage of ministry on a pipeline. And I want to come to my closing, and I just want to show you an image that it's just a really powerful image for me, and an image that I hope gives you hope. And if you see, it's concrete or ground or hardness, and then you see something growing from it. And sometimes that's what we as youth ministers do, is that we help for things to grow even in rough and hard places. The scripture, one of my favorite scriptures, is hope deferred makes the heart sick, but a longing fulfilled is a tree of life. And so I wanted us all to stand really quickly and say together, as a way to close out our time together, to all recite this poem, also by Langston Hughes. We started off with a dream deferred, and now we want to close with Dream Keeper. And so let us read this together. Bring me all of your dreams, you dreamer. Bring me all your heart melodies, that I may wrap them in a blue cloud cloth, away from the too rough fingers of the world.
I believe the children are our future. Teach them well and let them lead the way. Show them all the beauty they possess inside. Give them a sense of pride to make it easier. Let the children's laughter remind us how we used to be. Everybody's searching for a hero. People need someone to look up to. Never found anyone who fulfilled my needs. A lonely place to be. So I learned to depend on me. I decided long ago never to walk in anyone's shadows. If I fail, if I succeed, at least I live as I believe. No matter what they take from me, they can't take away my dignity, because the greatest love of all is happening to me. I found the greatest love of all inside of me. The greatest love of all. It's easy to achieve. Learning to love yourself, it is the greatest love of all. And if by chance that special place that you've been dreaming of lead you to a lonely